Island gigantism is a biological phenomena where some population reaches an island and then becomes gigantic compared to the mainland population. However, recent research calls into question if island gigantism is the pattern we see or an extinction bias. Today's video will break down island gigantism, but also why emerging research leads us to believe that it is not the case in Galapagos giant tortoises. We'll also touch quite a bit on Galapagos giant tortoises and a little bit of Charles Darwin's habit for eating them. So let's break down island gigantism. We first assume that there is some mainland population of tortoise, and we're using these figures here to represent small tortoises and large tortoises here, represented by the more Galapagos tortoise-looking tortoises. But we have some mainland population that is presumably a small or a medium-sized tortoise. We know in nature that this absolutely does happen. In South America, we have the red-footed tortoises, for example, which are in the same genus as the Galapagos tortoise. So how did some populations of these mainland tortoises actually reach the islands? Well, could be any number of explanations. One could just be the fact that the sea levels were at a different level 10,000, a million years ago, 20 million years ago, and that enabled there to be a land bridge. So at some point over, many generations, over tens of thousands of years, some of these small tortoises were able to reach the islands, and then subsequent changes in the sea levels led to them being fully detached from the mainland. So that's a pretty common explanation for many islands. There are also some theories about rafting, so they can get on some debris, say from a storm, a small tortoise or maybe some eggs, or a gravid female can get on this raft and essentially float and be sort of shipwrecked on the island where they can then reproduce. It's not necessarily important how the populations ended up on the island. What matters is that right now we have this scenario where we have some populations on the mainland and some on the island that are no longer connected. They are not exchanging genetic material. They are not mating and passing on information to the next generation. Over time, these populations will diverge from one another. So why do organisms become gigantic on islands? One of the answers is simply genetic drift. So we know that species are affected by random forces, random selection of the population and what genes are passed on to the next generation. And on islands, the effects of drift are much, much higher. Often you're working with small populations that are being, have less opportunities to select a mate, right? So selection isn't acting as strongly on these populations compared to random forces. And we know that organisms exist on a spectrum of traits. So if we're looking at something like their overall size, maybe we're doing mass, we know that all of the organisms on both populations, island and mainland, have some distribution of their trait. So maybe this is a normal distribution for size. We know that organisms will diverge over time. So then let's ask a slightly different question. Is it more likely that the organisms on the island will stay the same size compared to their mainland counterparts, or is it more likely they will be a different size given enough time? Bigger or smaller, will they be a different size? Think about that. I'll count down from 5. It's more likely they're going to be a different size. If we look at this size graph, let's zoom in on it, right? What we're basically saying is, will this average change? Will the average size of the population change over time? And yeah, we know that random chance is affecting these populations. So maybe for that next generation, that median, that mean just shifts ever so slightly, right? Maybe instead of a mass of 100 grams, now their mass is 101 grams, right? This is just a shift, a tiny little shift over a single generation, right? Okay. What happens if that shift compounds over hundreds and thousands of generations, right? Each time that line creeping a little bit more and a little bit more towards a larger size. And absolutely, when we're talking about random chance and genetic drift, there is always the possibility that the line could move in the other direction. Maybe the tortoises actually get smaller. Maybe if we want to expand this out, maybe the lizards that reach the island end up shrinking in size, or maybe the boas that end up reaching the island end up shrinking in size. And what do we find? Actually, this right here is not just describing island gigantism, but also the process of island dwarfism. I added a few icons to represent this visually. So really, island dwarfism and island gigantism are two sides of the genetic drift coin. And it's really important to remember that, because what we're seeing here is, yes, natural selection will have some effects here on these populations. I don't want to make it seem like this is just a purely random chance. Of course, if there is some evolutionary benefit to being a larger size or a smaller size, this will only enhance the pattern. However, it's important to note that drift is typically what is causing this variation in the first place, which is causing the changes and the divergence from that mainland population. So if we go back to our primary example, this island population underneath this island gigantism scenario just over time became a little bit larger and a little bit larger until, boom, we have the giant tortoises of the Galapagos we see today. And I really don't want to undersell how giant these tortoises are. They're closely related cousins on the mainland, the red-footed tortoises that I mentioned earlier. They reach about 9 kilograms, while the Galapagos Giant Tortoises reach over 400. They are massively different. However, is this because of island gigantism or something else? My master's research utilized the geographic and evolutionary information for the world's turtles. And during so, I learned quite a bit about where turtles are and where they used to be, including research about recently extinct tortoises. There were 2 fossils which poked major holes in this island gigantism theory, those being Colonization meridiana and Colonization lutzae. Both of these are giant tortoises, which were found in Argentina, so mainland South America, with meridiana being found 15 million years ago and evidence for lutzae being as recent as 30,000 years ago. So why does this matter? Well, if you'll remember, under this island gigantism theory, the tortoises were not giant to begin with. In fact, I have this illustration here, which shows that process. Remember, we have these small tortoises on the mainland here at 1, and then they get to the island in some way. Maybe it was changing sea levels, and then they become giant until they become the giant tortoises that we know today, and the tortoises on the mainland were still small. However, that doesn't seem to be what happened with Galapagos giant tortoises. Not at all. So let's redo our scenario, because now we know that there are giant tortoises on the mainland. So then how did they get to the island, and why do we have this pattern where they are only on the islands and not on the mainland? Well, the first part, how did they get to the island, is pretty much the exact same as the previous scenario. They were able to raft across. I mean, these tortoises are giant, but their babies are still only about this big, Now this, I do want to add a little bit of an asterisk here. We are assuming now that it is likely that a giant tortoise reached the island, not a small tortoise. It could absolutely still be the case that a small tortoise reached the island, some ancestral species, and then they became giant independently of the other giant tortoises in South America. That is still a possibility. However, given the evidence, it seems more likely that it's going to be a giant tortoise made its way to the islands. So then what happens to the giant tortoises that were still on the mainland, right? What is that second part? There is a fantastic paper called The Broken Zigzag. There are 2 primary reasons why these tortoises went extinct. There is compelling evidence that many clades went extinct due to the various glaciation periods over the last 20,000, 30,000, 50,000 years ago. This was a period where there was, ice caps receding and then ice caps receding and then refreezing on a cycle again and again. And this has influenced the distribution of almost every species on this planet. And with that, many went extinct. I don't want to undersell that extinction is a natural process that occurs. The second major contributing force was, of course, humans. Now, the paper that I'm referencing definitely goes into way greater depth and even talks about how we have this relationship of consuming turtles since before we were even humans. There's early hominids that have evidence. So our earliest ancestors were consuming freshwater turtle eggs, for example. However, the pattern that we're seeing here is one of a more recently caused human mass extinction event, and it's all related to colonization. The extinction of many large mammals and tortoises coincides with a period of colonization starting in South America. The mammals were hunted for their food or their fur or for other parts to sell, and they were, of course, hunted if they were considered dangerous to the colonizers. So we have many large species that went extinct during this time. The tortoises, however, went extinct for a slightly different reason. You see, giant tortoises are quite easy to catch. They contain a considerable amount of meat, and they don't really require much care. They do have very slow metabolisms. And again, they are very, very not dangerous to humans. So they can be loaded onto ships en masse and live on those ships for months at a time in an era before refrigeration. Essentially, these were long-lasting food storage is what the colonizing ships saw the tortoises as. So as the colonizing forces moved through South America, any tortoises that were not extinct due to climate change or due to other hunting going on in the region, they were systematically removed from the mainland, what resulting, here we go, in a pattern that looks remarkably similar to island gigantism. Now, I really do not want to make it seem like the Galapagos giant tortoises were completely unaffected. In fact, when the Spaniards first arrived in the Galapagos in the 1500s, up until the 1970s, about 250,000 tortoises were harvested from the island, and it's why they became an endangered species. In fact, Charles Darwin himself loaded up 30 tortoises onto the Beagle when he arrived on his fateful buffet voyage to the Galapagos Islands. I actually took a quote of his that he wrote in his journal for the blog post that covers the same concept. While staying in the upper region, we lived entirely upon tortoise meat. The breastplate roasted as the gauchos do, carne con cuero, with the flesh on it. It is very good, and the young tortoises make excellent soup. But otherwise, the meat to my taste is indifferent. Complete side note, Darwin was actually a prolific taster of exotic animals, and it would be a phenomenal video idea to actually do like a ranked tier list of all of his descriptions of animals and see what they end up being. If you want to do that, let me know in the comments, and if this video reaches 50 likes, I'll do it. Cool. Back to the video. And you may be wondering, so what? So what that we now know that this was because of extinction, not necessarily island gigantism, and we just, got it wrong. Why does that matter? And it matters because we got that wrong. And it matters because this extinction bias, this pattern of mass extinctions that happen over an entire continent, and indeed over the entire world, influences our understanding of that world. And it influences our relationship with that world, right? I mean, so imagine this. Imagine if the Galapagos giant tortoises did go extinct. Imagine if the colonizers were more hungry than they were, right? And they completely removed these island populations, right? Darwin reached these islands, 300 years after colonization first happened. So 300 years after exploiting and pillaging and destroying many of these natural landscapes. 300 years of resource extraction, of extinction, and persecuting the people who have been on these islands, who have been on the mainland, who have been in these areas for thousands of years. There's this problem of you can't know what you don't know, right? So whenever we're making these conclusions, when we're trying to understand why do we have this pattern of island gigantism, not having all the data available makes it really freaking hard to figure out what we're doing. Imagine if those tortoises went extinct and then Darwin reached the islands. Would he have come up with on the theory of natural selection? Would he have even written that? Because of course he saw the variation in bill size in finches, which were later named after him. However, it was also pointed out to him by people who lived on the Galapagos and in what was now Ecuador, that they could tell the tortoises apart based on the shapes of the shells. They could accurately tell you which island a tortoise came from based on its physical appearance. If Darwin had never learned that from the local people, would he have incorporated that into his understanding of the finch's beaks? That's why this is important, and that's why extinction, it robs us of understanding. And of course, extinction can be good. It can actually tell us a lot about the natural world. After all, we found those fossils. We know organisms went extinct, and we can deduce it may be due to global climate shifts based on the period from where we can say these fossils were from. So extinction isn't always bad, but humans are causing the extinction of numerous species, of numerous habitats, of numerous landscapes at a rate and scale and scope that has rarely been seen on this planet aside from planetary mass extinctions. And then again, we are in the sixth mass extinction, the Anthropocene. We are causing the extinction of many organisms. But we're also the ones who are going to save them. Because we always say that, oh, it's awful, everyone killed everything, right? But also, we now know more about these animals because of humans, right? We also are the ones that are going to be protecting them. Humans are also the ones running Galapagos tortoise conservation programs. Humans are also the ones reintroducing them on the islands. Humans are also the ones creating entire organizations dedicated to saving every single turtle on this planet. So I understand that human beings have done a whole lot of awful things in this world. Not the majority. In fact, the majority are trying to do good in the world, but are stopped for whatever reason. Where I'm getting at, where I want to end this video, is that so often in our natural areas, we are seeing them under a pattern of extinction. In fact, many of the areas that we know and love very likely did not look that way at all 300 years ago. And that's something we need to keep in mind, that the ecosystems we see today are all impacted, influenced, and modified by humans. Humans have done so sustainably for thousands and thousands of years, but in the last few hundred, we have influenced every single corner of this world. And we need to be aware. Are we seeing patterns such as island gigantism, or are we seeing patterns of extinction? I'll leave you with that. I don't know how to end it. Cool. Let me know what you think.